Witness. Voice of Witness, Storytelling as Resistance, a feminist approach to oral history. Um, if you would like to turn on closed captioning, you'll find the live transcript icon at the bottom menu of your, yes, it's now been enabled. So you'll find that icon at the bottom menu. And you can choose your subtitle option. The chat is disabled, but you can drop your questions and comments in the Q&A also at the bottom of the screen. And questions will be answered near the end of the session. So my name is Carla Strand, she, her. I'm the Gender and Women's Studies librarian at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. You may also be familiar with my columns, mostly about books at Ms. Magazine. I'm a queer white settler with long brown hair and glasses, and I come to you today from my home office, which occupies stolen Potawatomi land. We'd like to take a moment first to honor the Indigenous peoples who care for the land on which we are located, and we ask you to do the same. We're grateful for the Indigenous and ally labor that went into creating UW-Madison's land acknowledgement, and we also understand that institutional land acknowledgements are limited and deeply inadequate responses to the erasure, violence, and legacy of trauma brought on by settler colonialism. With this in mind, we will begin the day or this session with the abbreviated version of the UW-Madison land acknowledgement. But then we will also share a paragraph that's the result of our own critical thinking about this practice. So the University of Wisconsin-Madison is a land grab institution that occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a place their nation calls Dejope. The Ho-Chunk were forced to cede the territory in 1832 and survived decades of ethnic cleansing when both the federal and state governments repeatedly but unsuccessfully sought to forcibly remove them from Wisconsin. We honor the inherent sovereignty of the Ho-Chunk Nation, along with the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. As white settlers, we acknowledge the violence, dispossession, removal, erasure, and genocide that led to the colonization of the land, the attempted destruction of communities and lifeways, and the enslavement of millions upon whose forced labor this country was built. Since our conference is taking place virtually, we consider the legacy of colonization embedded within the technology we're using, which remains unavailable in many Indigenous communities, that is made from materials extracted from the land, and that contributes to changing climates that disproportionately affect Indigenous peoples worldwide. We acknowledge the unearned benefits we receive from this continued systemic oppression. We are committed to individual and collective action to disrupt this system in support of the full sovereignty of Native peoples, as well as the restoration of stolen land and resources, cultures, language, and histories of Indigenous, Black, and other people of the global majority who continue to live, learn, work, and thrive on these lands. We encourage you to take a look at the link we're going to drop in the chat, which is a bibliography we've created entitled From Land Acknowledgement to Action. The resources there can help you investigate whose land you occupy and Indigenous critiques of land acknowledgements, and hopefully provide you some resources to take action, which is really the most important thing. So I'm so excited for this keynote because I'm such a big fan of the Voice of Witness project. So I'm going to get right to it and give you a bit of an introduction. So Voice of Witness, also known as VOW or VOW, is an oral history nonprofit that advances human rights by amplifying voices of people impacted by and fighting against injustice. VOW's work is driven by the transformative power of the story and by a strong belief that an understanding of systemic injustice is incomplete without deep listening and learning from the people with firsthand experience. Through an oral history book series, here are some of them. I encourage you, and we'll drop that link too. I encourage you to take a look at the book series. And there's also an educational program. So through these resources, VOW amplifies unheard voices, partners with human rights activists, advocates, and teaches ethics-driven storytelling. So I'm thrilled to introduce now Dao X Tran, the managing editor of Voice of Witness. who will be moderating this event today. And previously, Dow worked as a senior editor at Haymarket Books, one of my favorite and as a freelance book editor. So she's currently based in Brooklyn on Canarsie, Muncie, Lenape land, and mothers both a teenager, Quyen, and a small but fierce terrier mix named Paisley. Dow, it is so good to see you again, and thanks so much to you and the panelists for joining us today. So I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Carla. What a lovely introduction to both Val and to me. Just for people tuning in, I am an Asian woman in my late 40s. I'm wearing my readers so I can see the screen clearly. I have long dark hair and 2 pigtails. I'm wearing a headset with a microphone as well. And in honor of our storytelling theme, I'm wearing a tunic dress that has pockets. It was designed by a Finnish designer who, when she was going off on her honeymoon, wanted to have a place for people to slip little notes of good wishes and thoughts for her in her being married, I guess. But I love the dress, I love the pockets, and I love the story behind it. Our hope for this plenary is basically, we're so excited to be able to connect threads across 3 of our most recent projects. We've got beautiful narrators from all 3 books. First, How We Go Home, our book on Indigenous voices from North America, Mi Maria, voices from Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, Solito Solita, crossing borders with youth refugees from Central America. And, you know, with this bringing together of narrators from across 3 projects, we're hoping to explore how ethics-driven oral history can be a liberatory methodology, one that embodies both a feminist and intersectional approach to storytelling. Your speakers today will also discuss questions learned from the pandemic and how we can envision and ensure structures and practices that really highlight reclamation, justice, and equity. I'd love to let the narrators briefly say hello now, say where they're calling from, give a little bit of a visual description of themselves, and then I'll give a more detailed intro before each of them reads their narrative excerpts in a little bit. So I'll turn it over first to Ashley.
Gamadhu, Inyeptimoy Ashley Hemmers, Ahamakavidum, Hokolo Imanovich. Hi, my name is Ashley Hemmers. I come from Avikwame, which is their sacred mountain, just a little to the north of me. And I introduced myself in my Mojave language because I am interested in sharing community with you today, and it helps me to center myself when I'm centered in my language. I just think in my language. It helps me to remember my stories in my language, and so I'm glad I'm able to share that with you. In terms of my visual description, I am wearing black, but I promise I'm happy it's Friday. I have my hair up, it's long, dark, and braided and put in the back. I'm also wearing beaded earrings from one of my students at our cultural center. And I am so happy to be here with you this morning. Thank you.
How about Luz? Luz, you can go next.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Luz, and I'm calling from San Francisco, California, Ohlone land. And my visual description, I'm wearing a green shirt. I have a long hair. I'm a Latina from Honduras, wearing white earrings. Behind me is a white wall. And yeah, I'm happy to be here today.
Wonderful. Thank you. Laurel? Oh, I think you're still muted, Laurel.
Sorry, now you can hear me. Hello.
Yes.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Lorel Cubano. I'm connecting from the islands of Puerto Rico, which is an unincorporated U.S. territory in the Caribbean. Okay, our Tainos are recognized as being part of the First Nation by the indigenous tribes, but not by the federal government. That affects us because we do not have any of the benefits of the First Nation. This conversation makes me think of all Puerto Ricans, the 5.7 million Puerto Ricans in the diaspora that have been forced to migrate during different economic crises in search of better living conditions than those of Puerto Rico. These American citizens are fighting and resisting racism and inequality. And it also makes me think about the 3.2 million Puerto Ricans who live on in our island under conditions of austerity imposed by an unelected fiscal control board. But on a brighter note, I am beige, not white, because I'm being Puerto Rican. I'm very mixed. I got a Black grandma, an indigenous grandma, and my brothers and sisters are all different colors. Honestly, my big sister is brown, yellow eyes. My brother is green-eyed, a little darker, and then I'm big haired, brown hair, big dark blue eyes. Yes, I've been bullied for being too white. Yet I have been discriminated for being the granddaughter of a woman of color. So it's very interesting being Puerto Rican. I'm wearing green glasses with flowers. I'm wearing flowers in my dress, in my earrings, because they make me happy. It's part of who I am.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. So in this next brief section, I want to just share some of the context about the feminist nature of ethics-driven oral history. And I'll start just with a quote. One of my favorite writers, Arundhati Roy, she put it this way: "There's really no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." So at Voice of Witness, our mission is to advance human rights by amplifying these seldom heard voices of people impacted by fighting against injustice. And with every Voice of Witness narrative, we aim for a novelistic level of detail in order to really help narrators portray themselves as individuals individual. We really foreground invitation to complexity, to nuance, and even contradictions in this intersectional work of structural change. So we're always thinking about how can we do this, both practically and ethically. One critical thing that we try to do is flip that dynamic of who is considered an expert. So doctors, lawyers, scholars aren't actually the central storytellers here. The key experts in our view, and we hope in yours, are the people who have directly experienced and been affected by injustice. And the reason we do this, we really believe that through personal narrative and oral history, we can all get a little closer to people through their stories. And as many of you are already convinced of, I'm sure I don't have to, prop this up, but sharing stories can be powerful and transformative. And why is that? We think it's because when you have that kind of immersive intimacy and the vulnerability that telling very personal stories requires, it actually transmits such valuable insights that are really difficult to come by otherwise. These personal narratives can, for instance, bring like big historical events down to a human level. So one of the things that I always like to compare is you might read a human rights report, but they're generally pretty dry, right? And you might have 2 or 3 sentences that have been extracted from, you know, many different interviews, but that can really be so different by reading a narrative that has urgency, that has drama, that has tension and surprise, you know, something that reads like a novel. So we recognize that while oral history is among the most egalitarian, accessible, and compelling forms of storytelling, it's also really, really time and resource intensive. And I think that the process of the relational aspects of oral history is really where you get, you know, that's the embodiment of the feminist ethics behind storytelling. Some of the hallmarks of that approach, I think, are being conscious of and transparent about the power dynamics, particularly between interviewers and narrators. And, you know, having a trauma-informed approach, knowing that, you know, you risk re-traumatization in the retelling of these stories, and that we do everything that we can to avoid that, and also, you know, support narrators in their telling. We believe that it's a deeply collaborative process. So this sharing for the narrators, listening for the interviewers, and reading and listening again for readers are all acts of love and generosity. And that's really what we try to cultivate. And this is, of course, we hope, the opposite of extractive. It takes huge amounts of time and investing in what we call moving at the speed of trust. It's cultivating relationships, cultivating stories, and cultivating community. And 2 final things that I'll just say, it's consent-based at every stage. So maybe our narrators can share with you all a little bit more about the process, but, you know, ideally, everybody reviews their narratives at many stages, at the transcript stage, at the rough draft stage. I'm sure some of you remember how often you were getting calls and emails. Can you read this part over? Do we need to say something different? Do you want to go back to this and say more about this? And I really think that that is what distinguishes VOW narratives from, you know, many other sorts of oral histories, where it's very clear narrators always own their stories and they're informed about where and how the narratives will be included or made public. And ideally, everything that I've just run through really quickly is in the DNA of doing oral history and doing it in an ethical way. So with that, I'd love to invite our narrators to each read a short excerpt from their narratives, and I'll have a question for everyone. So we'll just take a little time, because it's really important to hear your voices and hear what you have to say about how you think the process of getting your stories from your memories into book form. And I'd love to start here with Ashley. Ashley, let me just introduce you a little bit more, because I feel like people may not have had a chance to look at the books or read the narratives in full, but I hope they will. Ashley Hemmers is a narrator in our book, How We Go Home, Voices from Indigenous North America. She's an enrolled member of the Fort Mojave Indian tribe, whose reservation spans across the states of California, Arizona, and Nevada. Growing up in the American Southwest, Ashley experienced challenges around intergenerational trauma, environmental racism, and a lack of Indigenous representation in education. After leaving Fort Mojave Reservation for a degree program at Yale and then returning home, Ashley is now a Mojave tribal administrator and specializes in strategic development and management of tribal economies. Take it away, Ashley.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to share a piece of my narrative. and I will just start now. My grandmother lived through a number of the assimilation policies the US used against Native American tribes. In her lifetime, you can see the fragmentation that happened to people who went through these programs and the effect on their families. For example, my mom and her siblings knew a very different version of my grandma than my brother and I know. When she was raising my mom and her siblings, she was resolving, I'm sorry, I was reading from my screen. Um, so I'm back now. But when she was raising my mom and her siblings, she was resolving all of the stuff she had been through and not doing a very good job of that. Of course, she always had a house, stuff to eat, but alcohol was a factor for her. So my mom had a very different upbringing with her than I did. My brother and I were really my grandmother's second chance kids. She was able to share how to pray for someone in our language, how to care for someone in our language, and what it means to feel as a Mojave. She wasn't able to share that with her children, what she can now that she's more comfortable expressing who she is. When I talk about assimilation and fragmentation in my family, you can see it within just 3 generations. At work, we push resources to counter assimilation's effects, but it's like putting a band-aid on a gunshot wound. You don't have the right tools to take the bullet out, and so that bullet keeps hurting you no matter how hard you're working. Thank you.
So sorry, Ashley. I was trying to share the shot of the book and what you were doing. Maybe I won't do that because if it's interrupting people's reading. Anyway, in your narrative, Ashley, you speak about the effects of centuries of assimilationist policies within this context of settler colonialism that we still live in today. Can you share more about how you saw these policies impacting multiple generations within your family and your community?
Sure. So I want to just preface this with saying that I am a Southwest tribe. So each tribe, there are over 565 tribes in the US, and each of them have a different relationship with the United States government. And so for my tribe, we're situated deep in the heart of the Mojave Desert. I mean, it gets 120 degrees here at like midnight in the desert. And so it's really hot here. So for the longest time, our environment protected and sheltered us from a lot of the colonial interactions than some of the tribes that are further along the coast or in different areas, because no one was really habitating our part of the desert. So we had some posts, some railroads, some military posts, and that's where our current name Fort Mojave comes from, is from a post that's close to where my tribe is situated. And I say that only to say that these assimilation policies, there are 3 distinct eras. There's termination, there's assimilation, and then there's self-determination. And sometimes with tribes, as the further they got west, the further the US, got closer to different types of tribes, they accelerated that process. And so for my tribe, my grandmother is a survivor of termination policies, assimilation policies, relocation policies, and self-determination. And so when you think of that in the span of a lifetime, for tribes further east, they have that over, multiple generations. For my tribe, we're really talking about the 1930s to now, in one lifetime, how those policies can impact intergenerationally and the disruption and fragmentation that that can cause. And so for us, when we talk about how we go home, it's a little bit different experience for me because I had the privilege to be able to be raised in my grandmother's home when she had healed from a lot of her experiences, and she had a willingness or found a strength to begin to share our identity with me, which was not my mother's experience. My mom experienced her going through that process. And so when we talk about how I can engage with my grandmother, it's very different than how my mother can even have a relationship with her because of that fragmentation. And so intergenerationally, those dynamics exist in our daily lives, and we have to be open and understanding. And as my grandmother gets older, I'm her caregiver alongside my mother. Those wounds from boarding school, from termination camp, because she was held in internment during World War II, they still affect her today. And so we have to remember that those things that they experience when they're children, they start to be harder to control when they're older, more vulnerable and fragile. And so for us, knowing her experience, knowing what she was put through in those schools, help us to have the empathy needed to calm her down sometimes, especially in her older age. She's approaching 87 now, to make sure that she's okay, to create a safe space for her. And we do that through sharing stories. Last night, I was sharing songs with her from our tradition. We were watching older movies and documentaries so that she could remember, because that's what helped her in her time in these camps, in these schools, was speaking her language to herself, remembering her stories for herself, and knowing that at some point she would be able to go home. I think you're on mute, Dow.
Sorry. I just wanted to share, I don't know if you can see this, but here's a little portrait of Ashley with her mother and her grandmother. It's in the book. Okay, thank you for all of that, Ashley. I want to introduce now Laurel Cubano Santiago, who is a narrator from our latest book in the series, Mi Maria, Surviving the Storm, Voices from Puerto Rico. Laurel is a community organizer with previous experience in the tourism industry. You can read about it in her narrative. She's the founder of the Old San Juan Heritage Foundation and the community arts center called Colectivo per Arte. After Hurricane Maria, Laurel mobilized mutual aid efforts with her community to feed hundreds of people, despite not receiving any aid from the supply ships that docked just minutes away from their neighborhood of La Perla in San Juan. And actually, I was worried about you, Laurel, because we heard in the last few days there was this huge power outage in Puerto Rico, and it's left something like 1 million people still without power.
1.5 million Puerto Ricans don't have power, and we are re-traumatized after living without power for months. So it's tough.
Yeah. So could I ask you to please share the excerpt from your narrative, and then I'll have a question for you.
Yeah, of course. And also, Ashley, thank you for your story, because it makes me understand my story better, because as being part of the First Nation but being denied that fact, most Puerto Ricans don't know that our stories are
Connected.
Yes, directly connected. I will say something about it later on. But yes, thank you for your story. I'm gonna read from mine. People here were and still are discriminated against because they are poor. We're literally on the outside of the wall of Old San Juan, one of the biggest tourist areas in Puerto Rico, and also a neighborhood where very affluent people live. I think we have one of the largest wealth disparities, if not the largest in the US. So that wall between the neighborhoods is literal, but it's also mental. I appreciate and love the historical wall, but I always wonder, how can I tear down that mental wall? Here and also in Puerto de Tierra, where my grandfather lived, are the communities where we get the poor. About 1,200 people live in La Perla right now. There are families that were born and raised here, and they pride themselves on that. But this is mostly a place where people come and go. The community is extremely vulnerable. Our people have been systematically treated badly all of our lives. Nobody is going to help our community because La Perla is also coveted now. This is prime real estate. In 2012, Mr. Donald Trump came here and he wanted to buy the land to turn this into Santorini or another Greek island community. If no help comes here, people are hoping that it becomes abandoned so they can just buy it up. That's what they want. That's why I say the lack of aid here is systemic. It is by design.
Thank you, Laurel. My question for you is kind of two questions, I guess. One of the overarching themes emerging from your narrative and from every narrative in this project was the extent of how government neglect in the weeks, months, and now years following the hurricane, and the community mutual efforts that took place in response. How did the lack of government support after the disaster impact your community, and how did your community respond? And you can answer that part, or what are the current ways that you're seeing the old laws and discriminatory practices impact Puerto Ricans? How are communities on the ground resisting and responding?
First of all, in 2017, after Hurricane Maria passed, in the face of government abandonment, I learned the importance of building community. Okay, I was able to understand how big our Puerto Rican community is in the diaspora. I was able to connect, and I also learned the impact that we have if we concert our actions together for a common good. I saw a larger family. The lack of response from government left us abandoned. What can I say? It was the worst hurricane in the history of Puerto Rico, and the response was governmental genocide. After Maria, I saw a story of pride and of prejudice once again. I want to put this a little bit into context because I'm a little bit of a nerd. I'm going to read an excerpt from W.W. Harris. He was a brigadier general of the U.S. That was assigned to the 65th Infantry, the most condecorated battalion in the history of the U.S. And the 65th Infantry was a response because the Puerto Ricans were not white. They could not be put with white people battalion. And they are of color, but there was a language barrier, so they couldn't be put with the blacks. So they decided to create this 65th Infantry. And they were the bravest soldier the US have ever seen. And he wrote about Puerto Ricans: no ethnic group has greater pride in itself and its heritage than Puerto Rican people, nor have I encountered any that can be more dedicated and zealous in support of the democratic principles for which the US stands. Many Puerto Ricans have fought to the death to uphold them. I close the quote. That's what I saw everywhere. Bravery, pride, love, kinship, solidarity, community. I saw one nation. We were functioning without a central government based from our own communities. What I saw was beautiful. It changed me.
Thank you, Laurel. Here, I would like to introduce Luz Hernandez. Luz is a narrator. Soledad Castillo is the name that we used in the book. The book is
I'm sorry,
Solitos.
now. I wanted to, because it was a two-sentence part, I felt that I didn't answer the second part of
Sure.
the question. And to me, it is important because I want to say, if to put into historical context, who was the person who decided to come to Puerto Rico, invade, and colonize. Okay, it was Mr. Brigadier General Nelson Miles. Okay, Nelson Miles played a leading role in nearly all of the U.S. Army campaign against the Amerindian tribes of the Great Plains. He was known as Bear Crow. He oversaw the most abominable criminal military blunder and horrible massacre of indigenous women, children, and tribes. Okay, he was the general in charge of that, and he was the guy sent down to Puerto Rico. He was our first military governor under the U.S. rule. Okay, and we are still ruled by the laws that guy made. How does that affect us Puerto Ricans? They are these laws are based mostly on bigotry and racism. And one of them is the Foraker Act, which designated Puerto Rico as an unorganized territory, and we cannot be self-governed because we Puerto Ricans, and this is written under law, we are lazy, ignorant, incapable of self-rule. Okay, it also says we are cannibals in there somewhere, and we don't deserve such fertile lands. Okay, that's one of the laws made by this guy who was in charge of the genocide of the Amerindian tribes coming down to Puerto Rico. Okay, also we have two laws, which is Law 22, the Jones Act, which prevents foreign flag ships from carrying cargo between the contiguous U.S. and Puerto Rico. That affects us because it raises the price $1.1 billion higher than it would cost us without that act. So we pay a lot of money for that. And after a 10-year recession in Puerto Rico, they enabled Act 22, the Individual Investors Act, that seeks to attract new residents to Puerto Rico by providing a total exemption for Puerto Rico income taxes, okay? And after Maria, we saw the relocation of high net worth individuals with the excuse of bringing humanitarian aid, but it was only because they saw the opportunities and the benefit they could seek out of the lands and the Puerto Rican people. They are bringing gentrification. The lack of knowledge of Puerto Rico's history is notable in the way they perceive us, and they treat us, Puerto Ricans, with disrespect, okay? I wanna say that we are not any of the things that they want us to believe about ourselves. We are not lazy, ignorant, and treacherous, and we are more than capable of self-rule, okay? We are constantly being gaslighted, okay? This is our land, okay? And Puerto Ricans are a nation, whether they like it or not, okay? And that's what I see, people getting together. On 2019, we ousted the corrupt governor that left the genocidal after Maria. And then we were gonna put things together and still fighting, but the COVID came. And now I'm hoping to see that again, okay? I'm hoping that we could change things down in Puerto Rico and bring about change.
Excellent. Thank you, Laurel. Sorry I cut you off prematurely. So next up is Luz Hernandez, a narrator in the book Solito Solita, Crossing Borders with Youth Refugees from Central America. Born in Honduras, Luz survived abuse and serious health challenges before migrating to the US at the tender age of 14. After experiencing mistreatment in the foster care system and homelessness in the Bay Area, she graduated from community college and worked as a housing case manager for foster youth. Luz is now studying in the UC Berkeley Master of Social Welfare program and has a vision of combining her personal experience and education to work with young people of color who faced abuse and trauma. So Luz, please
Thank
read
you,
your
Val.
excerpt.
Thank you, Laura, for sharing your story. That was really powerful. Appreciate it. The foster program paid the foster mom around $600 per month to take care of me. She had taken me to garage sales and buy me useless clothes with holes in and then for $1 to $2. Then she used the money from social services to buy things for her daughter at the mall and gave the receipts to the social worker. I saw all of these, but she said, "You better be nice to me because the other homes are worse. I'm treating you right." I didn't know how the system worked because no one told me that foster parents are not supposed to treat you like this. Even though the social worker spoke Spanish, she never asked me, "Soledad, how is everything going?" They're supposed to talk to the children first. But we never had a private conversation about what was happening in the house. I was scared and nobody was there for me.
Thank you, Luz. My question for you, in your narrative, you share about the abuse and challenges you faced in Honduras, which led you to walk across the desert at age 14 to seek asylum in the US. And too often stories of migration end there, but the dangers and challenges that you face didn't. Um, can you talk about some of the barriers you faced as an undocumented young person in the United States?
Yeah, you're right though. We often think that okay, this person already is in the U.S., everything is okay now, and the challenges doesn't end there. There's so many challenges that I had to face in order to be where I am today. And one of them is just coming to the new country, learning a new language, learning to the new culture. When I came, came with my father, but he left a year later. So I was alone in this country without any family member, without any support from anyone. And it was just so hard for me to communicate to other people because I didn't know the language. And also asking for support. I didn't know anyone. I didn't have papers. I didn't have any documentation. So every time I always dreamed to go to school since I was a child. But in my country, sixth grade is the all education that you can obtain. So when I came here, I was like, okay, now I can, go to school and like go to like achieve my dream of going or getting higher education. But I didn't have papers. So when I would go to talk to counselors, like, no, you don't qualify for financial aid. You can enroll in these classes. It was just so many challenges, and those discouraged me like many times to actually fight for my goals. Discrimination, a lot of discrimination. I remember I was interning in this job, and one of the persons told me, "You have a thick accent. You should go back to you should go back to college, or you should go back to your country." Because it was just, and they told those type of comments in your face, and I feel until now, I feel that those comments still affect me, and it made me question, where is home? Is my home in this country where I had lived for 15 years, or my home is back in Honduras? And it's a repetitive of reminding myself, yes, you belong here. You have worked so hard to be here, but there's so many, the lack of resources, the lack of support, language barriers, assimilating to the new culture. It's more than just a ride to the US.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think, just going back to the overall theme of this conference about resistance, centering resistance. I think that the act of storytelling can help actually expand this concept of resistance, building on what we laid out as sort of the keystones of doing ethical oral history and story sharing, especially when the story sharers have been historically oppressed, marginalized, and decentered. I think telling your stories can be a deeply rebellious and deeply subversive act. And resistance doesn't need to be defined just as people protesting in the streets, although that is always a wonderful thing, as Laurel can point to, but we can also define it expansively as a transformative process where narrators telling your story is a powerful act of resistance and reclamation and community building in and of itself. So this is a question for all of you. Can you talk about telling your story given that context? For instance, I'm curious if you can share if there was a moment or moments that invigorated and rooted you during the process of sharing your story, during which you connected to this idea of oral history as activism, as a way to build communal resistance. Maybe we can jump back to Ashley and have you start off.
Sure. I really appreciate that. I just want to kind of let the the audience know that this project started out as a senior thesis for a master's program that the editor Sarah Sinclair was doing, and so my introduction to her was really through a mutual friend who is Kumiai from San Diego, and lived in New York at the time and still lives in New York, and has really been a center or a grounding for Native students in undergraduate and graduate programs that migrate to the Northeast to go to Ivy League schools, because a lot of us, especially me from my reservation, I'm the only person in my nation in the 5 tribes that are sister nations close to me that's been to an Ivy League. And so I talk about that because when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's only been one Mojave to ever attend Yale. So you talk about, just the isolation of it all. We're able to find community in these kind of broader Native American networks. And that's what our mutual friend did for me and Sarah, who's the editor. And Sarah was working on an oral history project where she wanted to talk to people who came from the reservation, went to these elite institutions, and then had access to go back into their communities. Because for a lot of Native Americans, sometimes if they move away or if they weren't raised on the reservation, they're not able to come back and integrate into their government systems or do the hard work to help make systemic change even possible. And so there's only a few who've been able to reacclimate to their tribal communities and do it in such a way where they have resources and foundation to actually create community impacts. And so that's kind of the origination of the How We Go Home project. It really started talking to natives who have gone to these other institutions and come back home. And for me, my first response to our mutual friend whose name's Rick was, no, I don't know her. No, I'm not going to do this. But Rick is somewhat of an uncle to me now because he really helped to formulate this. So he was really a active participant in nurturing that relationship and creating that kinship. And so when I think of Sarah now, I think of her as part of my family because it's about me sharing my oral tradition. And because of how I grew up, I only share those things with people that I have a relationship to. So you most likely wouldn't have heard that story if it wasn't for Rick, who had built that relationship and nurtured it between me and Sarah over time. And so when we think about resilience and acting, sometimes you don't hear these stories because a lot of the people who are in them or living the experience are too busy to educate others on what's going on in our lives. And so if you don't have those folks who are able to create those kinships with people who are interested in this work, then a lot of our stories go untold. And so I see a lot of change makers or organizers or leaders in communities like mine whose stories are never shared. And so I like to kind of center that part in terms of the resistance and resilience, because if it weren't for the relationship, my story never would have happened.
Yes, thank you. Laurel, do you want to try and answer the question about the story sharing as resistance? What you think of that?
Sorry, I couldn't hear. Is it my turn?
If you want to go next, if not, I can.
No, it's just that your volume is.
I was asking if you can talk about telling your story in this context about understanding story sharing as an act of resistance. Were there moments or a moment that rooted you, that invigorated you during the oral history process where you connected with that idea?
Okay, yeah, sure. First of all, I don't see myself as a community leader. People see me as that. Okay, I act because I can't stand injustice and oppression. That's who I am. It moves me. If my voice can be heard, let it be heard. That's really what moves me. The response to Maria was governmental genocide, and people need to know about it. We have to raise our voices, especially my community, which is the poor, the underserved, the disenfranchised, living 2 minutes away from the government's mansion, not the governor's mansion. And we are not important enough to be helped. And people need to know about that. And if we are just 2 minutes away from the governor's mansion and they are not taking care of us, what about the people that live in the mountains 2 hours away? Okay. It was something that shouldn't have happened, but it's something that's been happening since 125 years ago when the US invaded us. Okay? It's just that now with the technology, you can see more stories, put 2 and 2 together and know what's really going on. But it's been going on since 125 years.
Thank you. Liz, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. In 2014, 2015, I was in this English class with my Professor Stephen Mayers, and we were reading the book Underground American. And this book is about people, stories about people who are undocumented. And during the class, I was reading a story about one of the narrators, and I started like tearing up. I was like, oh my God, I felt that I was reading my own story. We share similar challenges. And in my country, in my culture, we don't talk about our feelings. We don't talk about any trauma. Things happen in the house. I experienced physical, sexual abuse, violence in the house. And my mom never talked about it. And I was internalized all of that. And when I saw that I was reading stories about people with a similar experience, I didn't feel alone. I was like, oh my God, there's more people out there that have experienced my trauma. And Stephen, my professor, started doing this project and asked me, do you want to tell your story? And at the beginning, I was hesitating because in our family, you don't tell no one your business. This is not things that you're supposed to be talking about. But I was like, no, this is me. This is my story. This is who I am. And I had the right to share it. And I can tell people, other women, young women that are out there, I see you, I know what you're going through, and you're not alone. And just having a voice to tell people you have the right to tell what it like, to work with all that trauma, child trauma that we experience. And I feel that, yes, the process of sharing my story was harsh at times, but also was a way for me to heal all of that was inside of me, that nobody has. Stephen and Jonathan spent hours listening to my story, and the same way, and in a way that nobody has done it before. And I feel appreciated. And now that I have the opportunity to go out there and share my story with other young people, I feel that, you know, I can connect with it. People has come to me and say, thank you for talking about this. In Central America, we don't talk about sexual abuse. In our families, we don't talk about this topic. And you have, you know, like open it, like the option for me to actually speak up and talk about all this trauma. So that I feel that I have empowered other young girls to speak up, and at the same time for me to accept who I am and just have the freedom to express myself in a way that I couldn't do it in my country.
Thank you for sharing that. I wonder if at this point there are questions that you might have for each other that has come up, like in hearing each other talk about this process. I'm going to skip the pandemic question for now. We might come back to it, but I'm really interested in hearing, you know, your thoughts after hearing each other speak. And then I want to leave a bunch of time to, because I see there's already one question from the audience, but I'm sure there might be more. So I'd love to use, I think we have about 15 more minutes. So maybe to start off with you all asking each other questions, and then we might then ask Carla to come in and help us with doing some of the audience questions as well. Laura, you have to unmute.
I would love to be Ashley's friend from this, because I want to learn more about how we could heal the trauma, because you know more, you have studied more, and I have studied more the part of being colonized rather than the part of being an indigenous tribe and all the struggles. So yes, I would like to stay in touch with you and share stories and experiences, and maybe learn from that to share it down here with Puerto Ricans that have been denied of their story. And
Yeah.
we don't know where that comes from.
No, I think that I'm so excited because I was writing notes like, oh, I'm going to talk to her about this and send an email follow up about this, because I think it's so, one of the great things about Voice of Witness is connecting community. And I really appreciate that. And when I was listening to the narrative where they were like telling you to, I think it was Soledad or Luz, right? Luz, like go back to your country. Oh, it makes me so heated. I'm like, well, first of all, this is indigenous land. So yeah, thank you guys for being so open with your story, because there's so much interconnection between our past, and sometimes I think we center colonialism a little much in terms of, you know, what it is, but it's never really been proven to be a system that works. It's been proven to be a system that destroys. And I'm happy that, you know, our experiences and our shared experiences and the way that storytelling helps us reconnect to one another or connect to other people is being seen as a practical approach to grounding humanness so that you can feel that connection between one another.
Feel free to jump in, Luz.
you know, I came to this country when I was 14, started going to college when I was 18. So I feel that there's a lot still to learn. And now that I'm in the master, I'm learning about, you know, how social workers took away children's, you know, indigenous children's from the parents. And I was just, when I was in Honduras, people talk about United States at this amazing country. And don't take me wrong, I feel so blessed to be here. I feel that has opened a lot of opportunities for me. I wouldn't be who I am without, you know, the support too that I have got for the community, but also learning more for the history, what has happened, you know, to indigenous people, to indigenous children. It's just heartbreaking. And the more that I learn, the more that I ask myself, like, as a social worker, how I'm going to approach this family, how to educate myself, to better serve, you know, families that have been affected by this, you know, these systematic issues. And what can we be? What else can we, like? I know we're acknowledging the land, but what else do you think we can do as a community, as a society, to you know, to help these people to heal all that trauma?
And it's basic that we heal that trauma to move forward. And we're not taking time, we're not pausing to take a deeper look at what it is, what it has brought to us, how we could let that go and then move forward. We need to have more of these conversations. I love it.
Yeah, I love learning about your you know, your journey and your educational journey, Luz, because that's one of the things that I'm working on now with my own nation and rethinking our foster care system. We've been working for over a decade now to redefine what fostering a child really means and how we want them to be raised and the values set forth, because the foster system that you described so perfectly is literally just paying people to take children and not having a sense of accountability for that. And I know Indian nations are working really hard now because the Indian Child Welfare Act, which allows us to be more strongly involved in our child's process, is now being threatened politically. And, you know, these acts have been put into place because families like mine have been impacted, where they took my grandmother away when she was 4 and put her in internment. And then when they put her in internment after the war and let everyone else home, they kept Indian children and placed them in boarding schools. And these are the only schools in the US that have cemeteries. And so I remember last June when the first uncovered children were being, the 215 were being, you know, risen from their schools. This is a hurt that Indigenous communities have. We have lost children, and those burdens are within our communities. And acknowledging that is not only, you know, something that our communities have to face, but it's going to be a very interesting path forward, because the folks who are responsible for implementing those policies haven't even acknowledged that that actually took place. And so it's one thing to have a land acknowledgement, but it's a whole other thing to talk about how these types of behaviors have actually led to actions that have been so destructful in Indigenous communities, and it's still happening. So yeah, I just wanted to make that comment really quickly.
Yeah, thank you. Carla, I don't know if you want to come in and help.
We cannot hear you now.
Carla,
There you
did
go.
you want to
Yeah.
come in?
Yeah, if you could
Sorry.
just move your mic, yeah, a little bit closer, that'd be great. Yes, we have some questions coming in, and I know that you can see those as well. So if you want to take a look, one of the easiest ones is that attendees want to know if you all are on social media or how they can keep up with you. So if we could put those in the chat as well, if you have them. Dow, did you have questions on the Q&A that you would like to start with?
I think that we could just take them in order. They
Okay.
seem.
Sure, sure. So our first question is, how do we get these stories into the mass media so more people hear them while still maintaining the ethics of feminist transformative storytelling? It's a great question.
Invite us to talk, that would be helpful. Use the curriculum, learn more, and share that with people who are in the media. I think that that would be a helpful place.
I know,
I
Carla,
was
you try to do your best too to get stuff in Ms. and other outlets. Sorry, Luz, go ahead.
I would say too, in order to learn from, talk to your neighbor. Sometimes we should see people on the street, like, tell me more about your story, where you come from. Get to like spend some time to get to know each other, like in the community. And as Ashley said too, like invite people of color to speak in this type of events. It's just spread the voice.
I wanted to say that yes, if you always want to invite us, I'm in. But you could help Puerto Rico by talking to your congressman, because Puerto Ricans don't have representation in Congress, and that would be helpful if people take interest on what's going on in Puerto Rico. Say, hey, you have 125-year-old law that's racist and bigot law. What are we gonna do about it? How can we help them? Just raise the question. That could be very, very, very helpful for us.
Great, thank you for that. Our next question is for Ashley. Wondering if you can speak more about your experiences at university and what can be done to raise the numbers of Native American students who are prepared to go to college.
Yeah, I think that there are so many great organizations that are helping across, across different Indian nations. But I'll just speak from my experience with my own nation. When I got back, I had a really point in my story where on my reservation, there's a lot of places where kids can get lost, and I was one of those lost kids. And my mom really fought hard for me, and shared her own vulnerability and wanting me to change and not wanting that lifestyle for me. And so we had a really big falling out, and I finally was just fed up. And so what I did was I was like, if I'm really good at being bad, I can be really good at being good. And so from that point forward, I'm like, okay, well, what do good people do and what do the best people do? And then I started to figure out, okay, what is college and how do I get there and what's the best one and how can I go there? And it was really not to learn, honestly, in the classroom, but it was really for me to see how these other folks lived and see what was so good about it and why it was so different from my own community, and then figure out how I can communicate my own experiences in a different world so that I can start bringing resources to the people that I loved. And so that really is what my university experience was. I got more out of networking and finding allies and mentors. And then for my own experience at home and the work that I do, what we did in 2008 was we created for our tribal members a 100% scholarship to any university in the world. Our package is complete 100%, no questions asked, and it's not GPA required. If you want to go to college, we will get you there, whether it's community, trade school, Ivy League. If you want to go to graduate school, PhD, we want you to do that. I'm still waiting for, I'm in like the pandemic took my PhD program away for a little bit, so I have to like revisit that. But we're still waiting for a Mojave doctor, a lawyer. The more tribal members that we have that are in these positions, the better they will be able to see these industries through a Mojave lens. And so that's what we're committed to. And it's been, over over 10 years since we've been doing this. And when we first started, we probably had maybe 3 or 4 in undergraduate or community college. And now we have a college internship program where children are graduating from traditional college. We have over 71 students in college at varying different levels. And it takes that time to grow, but by investing in our people, we're able to show them and have them trust that when they do that, it's not because we think that they have to be, you know, that they have to be like a colonial system, that's going to validate their existence, but that they have to learn these systems so that they can understand how to communicate within them. And then we can have conversations, because the system's not learning about us. Only conferences like this are very, you know, critical approaching groups are really taking this in a critical lens. And so until that becomes bigger, we're going to have to send our students to school so that they can speak that criticality, and then we can get the institutions to understand that there is a valuable voice there. Sorry, I went off on my tangent, but
No, it's such valuable information. And I think there's a question in the chat too, which is related to this, is like, once students get into university, how do they manage the pushback? How, I think some of you talked about, you know, being labeled the troublemaker, or, you know, if their work is brought into question. And I think we could even broaden that outside of the academy, right? I mean, into advocacy and activism, you know, more broadly speaking. Any ideas for how to manage the pushback?
I can answer that. I work right now on doing my field placement at the school district here at San Francisco, and I'm interning into schools, an elementary school and a high school. And I see a lot of those labels, you know, people, students of colors are labeled as, you know, misbehaving, troublemaker. And to me, as someone there at the school trying to support the student, trying to not to like trying to, you know, have conversations about those labels, right? You're not separating those behaviors from the student, and how to push back and just be advocating. You know, we need a lot of people advocating for students, and don't like I feel that students are when I go to the school, they are my inspiration. I do this work because of them, and I want to be the voice, you know. I want to be their voice. And like frequently, like trying to have meetings with the teacher, having joint meetings to other social workers, trying to find new interventions, so they're not pushing a student back. For me, trying to make the school as more equal, like having more like resources for everyone. And I don't know how to explain it. It's just, yeah, but there's a lot going on, and I feel that it should be there for them, and try to make your best to advocate for them.
I would say, I would like to add that we just have to remind ourselves that we are enough, that we are capable, and that we are brave and face the world. I don't care about that label. If that label means that I'm a troublemaker, means that I put a limit to your manipulation, then so be it. Okay, but you have to put limits to things that hurt you. And if that's gonna hurt you, just don't let it. Remind yourself that you are enough, that you are capable, and that you are brave, and keep going.
That's great. Thank you. We have more questions in the chat. We also have only 2 minutes left. So apologies for all of the questions that we probably will not get to, but thank you so much for your participation, those who have attended. I wonder if I'd just like to give you all sort of a last word, if you will, in 90 seconds or less. So does anyone have anything else to add or to share as parting words?
Just a thank you. Thank you for being in community with us and in hearing our story and being an active learner, because listening to our stories take a different critical, skill. And so thank you for that.
I would like to say, buy the book, please. Learn about not our story, the rest of the narrator stories that are amazing and that can give you more light on what's going on.
Yeah, I'd also invite people to check out voiceofwitness.org. Lots of resources on there. There's a blog part of it, and I think there's a question for me to talk about doing oral narrative work. There's actually I think an hour-long interview that I did with a podcast that's based in Britain, where I talk a ton about that. But yeah, I would loved having this chance to share this very unique space with narrators across 3 different projects. And I think the conversation was so fruitful and generative. And thank you all for being part of it.
I wanted to say to Luz, oh my God, I am awed. You are so brave. I love you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Wonderful, amazing. You're a survivor.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone, having the time to be in this conference and just being here with us. And we're so powerful, and there's so much greatness out there. And thank you, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was a pleasure. I'm going to hand it off to Steph, see if we have any final words to wrap up. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. This was an amazing panel, and I feel so honored that we had the opportunity to be part of this dialogue and ask questions. And thank you so much for your work and the amazing trail of resources for everyone to keep engaging and learning more. I have dropped information in the chat on how to join our next session. We have more conference events today and tomorrow, and we welcome everybody to join us in whatever capacity works for you. Everything is free and fully virtual and accessible. So please do your best to join us, because we have a lot of other amazing events that will continue some of the threads and strands that were part of this dialogue today. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day.
All right, thank you.